Steve, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Excited to talk about how things are looking on the ground now as we wait just a few more days before the election, but also educate ourselves, our audience, a little bit more on just how to think about sort of elections more broadly. So with that, why don't you give just a high-level overview on what is your stance on where things are shaking out right now? Is it a coin flip? Is it impossible to tell? How reliable are indicators? Why don't you go from there?
Yeah, I'll start off by saying it's really funny how I guess I feel like as a relatively close follower of, all the political trends online and on Twitter. This is basically my fourth go around because I followed the 2012 election very closely. This is dating myself. I'm in my mid 30s. And so we remember the 2012 election, 2016, 2020, 2024. And I definitely feel like I've seen all of the same patterns unfold online in all of these as you get closer to election day. And one of those is you can look at the state of the race in terms of polls, you can look at betting markets, and then you start getting into more and more, I just call it astrology. You see this with the people analyzing the early vote trends and how it's breaking down. And you'll find a lot of people maybe reading more into it than you can get away with. So you'll find people online right now, pretty serious people, who will say they know 100% that Trump is going to win because the early vote looks like this. You'll find people who think Kamala is going to win because the early vote looks like this. I think you'll see more who argue this way, who are on the Republican side. And I think that is because there are optimistic signs in the early vote, but you just can't read into it as much as people think. Because in the end, we don't know how people are voting. We don't know how independents are voting, even if we can measure them. We don't know a lot of things, and we don't know what the election day vote will be. So a strong GOP early vote could be because people who would be voting on election day have moved out into early voting. So maybe it used to be that you would have a big Republican advantage on election day. Now it could be, maybe it's more even. It might even be a Democrat advantage. It could be the only people left who haven't voted are young people. They'll vote on election day and they'll vote for Harris. So you can find a lot of people who are, I think, aggressively overreading signs, essentially because it's like lack of enough stimulus. Like we're all so starved for the results to come in that people grasp at anything they can. It's like when they would do Kremlinology during the Cold War and you'd try to read all this intent into how guys were standing during the parade in Red Square to see like, oh, who's on the ups and who's on the downs in the Kremlin. I think it's like that with a lot of what we're seeing right now. That's all an elaborate preface to say a lot of the models, Nate Silver's model, some other places, they have it as about a 50-50 race. And I think any honest assessment of how things are going is the race is about 50-50. And I think it's funny how if you look at prediction markets like Polymarket, for a while there was a skew where it was substantially more pro-Trump than a lot of the professional models had it. And now as we're getting close to election day, they're converging again. So now Trump is about, I think, 56% on Polymarket as I say this. And I think that's about where he is in Nate Silver's model. So I think in any honest assessment, it's a close race. It's about a coin flip. We could be surprised by how easily one of the candidates wins if the polls are off in a relatively systematic manner, just 1 or 2 points in either direction. But I think that's an honest assessment of how things are going right now. It's close.
And are we just like fated every election to have a sort of a close election like this? Is this sort of like the efficient theory of politics or something where it just there's two parties and it's like 51-49 leading up to the election? Or is this not sort of like fated to be this way?
That's an interesting question because the trend, as you know, is we have over time drifted more towards the elections always being close. So it used to be you could just have a total bloodbath. Goldwater lost really badly. I think he lost like 60-40 in terms of popular vote. Nixon won overwhelmingly. Reagan won like you had a sequence of 3 elections in a row where Reagan crushes Carter, crushes Mondale, and Bush beats Dukakis pretty strongly. And even Clinton's 2 elections, I don't think those are really in context remembered as big landslides, but if they happen today, they would be considered a totally dramatic landslide. So you used to have bigger swings. Are we fated to be that way forever? I don't know. There's one reason I think it went that way was you had the US became a more diverse country. Democrats had a larger and larger pool of non-white voters to draw on, and especially Hispanics and black voters were so monolithically Democratic that they were kind of just locked in for the Democrats. And I think that kind of put a ceiling on where Republicans could go. And it was like you only saw really heavy swings. Like basically white voters were more swing voters by nature. So they could swing more than the overall electorate would in any given election. And so if there's fewer white voters, you see less swing. And you still see that in some particular states. Like Iowa is relatively white, and they went from voting for Obama by a ton to voting for Trump by a ton. New Hampshire, it went from Trump lost it by like 0.5% or so, 1% maybe in 2016, to I think he lost it by 11% or so in 2020. So kind of states that have a heavily white population can be really swingy with how they go. Now, what we see in this election cycle, though, is Trump is somewhat cracking up that tradition. He is making it so maybe Hispanics are a swing demographic. Maybe even blacks are more of a 75% Democrat group instead of 95% Democrat. And if that is not a Trump specific thing, if it just points to a future where every group can swing more in terms of its outcome, then I think it would be possible we could see bigger landslides come back into play because every group is capable of swinging pretty heavily in one direction. Something that might push against that could also just be that US politics, like we have so much more data that we can bring to the table. We can so much more easily see what the trends are, what the reaction to things are. So I think it would be harder for a party to make a really dramatic mistake in terms of how they pitch themselves to the electorate. And that might play a role in how big a landslide could be. But yeah, for the foreseeable future, I think we'll continue to see pretty tight elections like this because you also see the polarization of America into sort of two tribes, and that polarization is still extremely strong, and I think you would need to see signs that is going away before you'd see, I think, an ability for any party to, say, win 40 states in an election again.
For the listener who's unfamiliar with sort of the math of which states really matter in terms of which states are determining previous and current elections, why don't you give just a bit of an overview to educate the listener?
Okay, yeah. So biggest picture, of course, is we have our fun electoral college system where you need a majority. Every state has a certain number of electoral votes. It's equal to its number of senators and representatives in Congress. And then there's also DC. They have, by amendment, they get 3 as well. So there's 538 electoral votes. Easy to remember that because 538 is the name of the website that Nate Silver founded and then got fired from. And now it's with someone else. And then you need 270 electoral votes to win with a majority. And other than a handful of exceptions, if you get the most votes in a state, you will get all of its electoral votes. So it's our fun mini game for electing the president that only exists in America, basically. That's a big picture. I imagine for any Americans who follow politics, they're pretty familiar with it, but it can be pretty baffling to people who are looking at it from another country. It gets bashed a lot. I think it has worked better in practice than it might in theory. America's been a relatively stable democratic country for a long time, and we have the Electoral College, and maybe that played a role. Every election, we have the nature of it means that instead of really campaigning on a nationwide level every single time, you tend to see campaigns focus on what states they think are the most likely to be so-called swing states. That is, they might go for one candidate or might go for the other. That changes every single election, and sometimes it's a little bit of guesswork, and they can even be pretty wrong about it. So, for example, in 2020, you saw gestures that like Ohio was a swing state that they should campaign in, and then Trump actually won Ohio very easily. It was not particularly close, and this cycle, you'll see no one's really been campaigning that hard in Ohio because it's assumed it will be a very safe Trump state. Instead, the states that you see getting added are mostly ones that were close in the last one. You also see North Carolina, which was not considered it was not considered like a top swing state maybe at the start of the year. It has moved into that column. It used to be kind of 6 major swing states. The 6 big swing states were Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, the Rust Belt ones, and then the Sun Belt ones were Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. And then you started to see North Carolina added to that. I think a big factor there was, one, it was pretty close in 2020, and it just didn't get as much attention because there was so much focus on the ones where all the recounts were happening. And then the other thing is they have a gubernatorial candidate, Mark Robinson, on the Republican side, who has had a rough go of it. He was a kind of controversial and inflammatory figure from the start. He kind of became famous for like Facebook rants and stuff like that. That's kind of how he took off. And then he got elected lieutenant governor off of that. And then since then, now he's running for governor. More weird, lurid stuff has come out where he posted on porn websites, and they found a lot of strange stuff about him in his past. So he's going to get massacred on Tuesday. He's going to get destroyed. And I think a lot of the angst is that he's depressed the overall GOP turnout there a bit. And on the flip side, Democrats are more motivated. They feel they can win it. So that was the state that was not considered super duper likely to change the election even, 9 months ago. And now I think you definitely see a lot of Republicans sweating it. You see a lot of Trump attention. I think he's holding 4 or 5 rallies there this weekend and in the last 3 days, basically. So that is one you could see decide it. And then other than that, you have the 6 I mentioned before. The most likely one to decide the election by general consensus is Pennsylvania. It has a high number of electoral votes. It went for Trump in 2016. It went for Biden in 2020. And if you do the math with the Electoral College, to get to 270, to summarize it very aggressively, if you take the 7 swing states, Trump almost certainly, he definitely needs to win one of Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania to be elected president. And Pennsylvania's seen as the most likely one for that to occur. So you see a lot of energy going into that state in just the last handful of days.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Hi, it's Erik. If you're looking to take a deeper dive into international affairs and business strategies, then I highly recommend listening to the new podcast, Dealcraft, Insights from Great Negotiators. Recently called a best podcast pick by The Guardian, Dealcraft features interviews with the world's greatest dealmakers and diplomats, including former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, Blackstone's Steve Schwarzman, and music industry super lawyer John Branca on their most challenging negotiations. Each episode, host Jim Sebenius, Harvard Business School professor and renowned negotiation expert, shares fascinating deal stories and distills useful insights for listeners to apply in their toughest deals and disputes. New episodes release weekly and explore everything from former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's negotiations with Vladimir Putin to how Costa Rican diplomat Cristina Figueres saved the Paris climate talks. So don't miss out. Follow Dealcraft, Insights from Great Negotiators on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Hey everyone, Erik here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lenihan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript, React, and Next.js ready to onboard to your team today. For back-end, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
Should Kamala have picked Shapiro?
That is a debate, especially if she loses. You'll be hearing that for a long time. I think the consensus is going in the direction that she probably should have picked Governor Shapiro. I think that that was who they all leaned towards in the immediate aftermath of her getting the nomination as the favorite. And I imagine a lot more details will come out about this in the months to come, especially if she loses, because you'll see people say, like, I tried to warn about this. I tried to pick a different path. You'll see all the recriminations bubble up. My guess right now, just from the evidence we have seen, is I think they were leaning towards Shapiro, and then they only had a few days to pick, and they like blinked, sort of, that people said, oh, Shapiro, he's very, very publicly Jewish and Zionist, and he volunteered with the IDF I can't remember the details. I think it was like a non-combat role, but he volunteered with the IDF. In the far left will just go berserk about this. They'll flip out about it. It'll exacerbate the divides within the Democrat Party over Israel and Gaza, and it'll just be a big mess. You also, in the last handful of days, there were some weird stories people started to bring up. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it was like there was a woman who committed suicide a decade ago, but her family believes she was murdered. And then like this AG or this DA played a role in that not being investigated further. And there was like 2 degrees of separation from that to Shapiro. He also had a staffer who I think got Me Too'd in a somewhat gross case. And so that would have been brought up. So I think all of that, even if they were, I think it's like if that had been a bigger deal several months ago and they had a longer picking process, they would have just gotten over it. They would have gotten to the bottom of all of that and just picked him. I think since they had such an abbreviated VP search process, that this might have flared up and made them freak out a bit and maybe back off from picking him. Of course, the public story is that Shapiro, there's also stories that Shapiro like didn't mesh well or like didn't have a good interview with Kamala when he met her. That might be a cover story for another reason they wanted to pick her, or they wanted to pick someone else. And lastly, one thing that has to be a possibility is it could be Shapiro's a canny political operator. He might have decided, I don't think Kamala is going to win. I want to run in 4 years. And so I don't want to be on this ticket, because if I'm on this ticket and we lose, I am unlikely to be able to run in 28. So that is also a possibility. He may have kind of intentionally sabotaged his own run for the vice presidency. And I think we'll learn more about it in the weeks to come. So I don't want to oversell what we know. It's for now one of those interesting political questions, but definitely I think if she loses because Pennsylvania goes the other way, the common sense pick will be she should have picked Shapiro. She should have done Shapiro, but maybe he wasn't really looking to be picked.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's talk about the sort of state of election integrity more broadly. Do you have concerns about this election in particular, / can you elucidate the concerns for people who do?
Yeah, so election integrity stuff, obviously I'm on the political right. You see people got very traumatized by the 2020 election and specifically how it unfolded. I know you've had Richard Hanania on your show before, and I think his description of the right as like a party of TV watchers is actually a very powerful one in terms of how a lot of ordinary people related to the 2020 election. That on 2020, they went into that night thinking that Trump, like the polls said Trump was way down. He was going to get annihilated. You thought, he could lose Florida. He could lose Ohio. He could lose Iowa. He was down by 8 or 9 points in Wisconsin. It was looking awful. And then everyone is shocked. The results start coming in and he's doing really well, surprisingly well. They were able to call Florida for him that night. He's destroying in Ohio. Everyone's thinking, oh my gosh, the exact same thing as that happened in 2016 is happening now. He gets these huge leads built up in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia. He's way out in front. And then a lot of people just go to bed then. Like, okay, Trump's way up. Not everyone's going to stay up till 2 a.m. They go to bed thinking Trump's got it. I think in the prediction markets that you could enter on, like FTX had a presidential market that you could bet on and stuff. I think Trump peaked at over 90%, maybe over 95%. He got very high briefly. And then you wake up the next morning and people are like, oh, actually, no, now Biden is favored. The leads have dropped dramatically in all of the Rust Belt states. And he's gaining. And then over the next few days, you see more ballot dumps come in and Biden ends up flipping several states and he gets elected president. This was a super traumatic process to a lot of people. And it unfolded in a way that made people's like BS detectors go off, that they were like, oh, Trump was way up. And then overnight, there's all these big ballot dumps that are super duper heavily in favor of Biden. And suddenly he's the winner. And you still run into those memes online where you can see it's like you can see that chart of like each vote total going up and Biden gets like the big jump I think you see that the literal version of that you'll see is from Wisconsin. And there's an explanation you can give for all of this. For example, in Wisconsin, all the early vote, all the mail-in votes for Milwaukee County were released all at once. So you didn't have like bit by bit. You just had a giant like 300,000 vote nuke dropped all at once. And it's the most Democrat county in Wisconsin. And it's the early vote, which is going to be more Democratic still. So yeah, you're going to have a giant blob of these votes and it's going to be all Democratic. You can explain that, but to normal people, who don't live in the political process, it's going to feel super duper BS. And so you saw that really stick with people. On top of that, it's just weird when it takes a long time to count the votes and we have this elongated counting process that I think really set people off. You had a lot of viral stories that would go on, like some press were reporting that they were shutting down counting for the night in Georgia, and then it turned out that I think some observers went home because of this belief, and then it turned out counting continued throughout the night. It was just a giant snarl of things. Add on to that there was a lot of censorship of the news on Twitter in 2020. The Hunter Biden laptop was shut down. It was 2020, so there were riots everywhere where, you couldn't go outside due to COVID unless you were actually going outside to riot over racial justice. There were so many things that made 2020 drive people nuts. So that is the environment that the right is working in, that they've had this super traumatic election that felt bogus to them. And I do think that Trump, for his own personal foibles, strongly egged that on. I don't agree with the criminal prosecutions from Jack Smith that like Trump knew he lost, but then he lied about it to try to overthrow democracy. I think Trump is just a very supremely confident individual. And if you read his interviews, Trump seems to believe that he wins every state, if not for fraud, that the Democrats use fraud for 50% of their votes. Does he really believe that? I don't know. It seems in character for him. He is like that. Going into this election, will they think it's fraud if he loses? I would be prepared for Trump to make that claim. I don't want to say too much more than that. I do think there have been efforts to make this race cleaner than past ones, and I don't think it will be as bad overall. We don't have as much early vote as we did in 2020. You also see some states like in Arizona, for example, they've changed the law to make them count it faster because slow counting creates suspicion. But I guess bluntly what I would say is a lot of people were very traumatized by 2020. Others got traumatized by 2022. There was some weird stuff again in Arizona where there was like election day issues. People are very emotionally invested in this. And if it goes badly, they tend to seize upon rumors. They seize upon conspiracies. They seize upon, allegations they can make to explain why what they didn't want to happen happened. What will happen from there? I think it would depend on the scale of what occurs. What I have said to a lot of people is I hope whatever the result is, that it's pretty decisive either way. I would rather have one of the candidates win in a bunch of states by 1 to 2 points as opposed to having it go down to a Florida in 2000 type situation where it's 400 votes either way in this decisive state. I just genuinely do worry that if that happens in America in its current state of polarization and political tumult, it would be hugely damaging to the country. And I don't like to contemplate that, but it's possible that it will occur.
Peter Thiel said something like either it's going to be a Trump blowout or Kamala is going to win because they'll do everything in their power to fortify the election. Do you think that is too aggressive, or do you think there's some credence to that?
I think he probably oversells it a bit. I think the ability of them, they always phrase it, they, them. People always like to forecast that they will do some dramatic thing. You used to see other versions of this even 20 years ago. I remember Democrats claiming, Bush was going to fake a terrorist attack or fake a potential terrorist attack in order to cancel the election or rig the vote in his favor. You see there's not a lot of weight behind these conspiracies. It's sort of just a generalized distrust of the enemy. People are sort of waiting for some sort of painful thing to happen. In reality, I think, I have some friends who've interacted with Democrats, and a lot of them, they often sound like they have sometimes they're running around like chickens with their heads cut off. I had a friend who met with a lot of DC Democrats last spring when Trump was romping towards the nomination. And he said one thing that stood out to him is they just didn't seem to have a plan. They didn't have a plan for what was going to happen with Trump. They were just hoping something would happen. Even with the assassination, there's a lot of theories that someone knew, someone engineered it. I suspect that's not the case. I think it was just a random nutball decided to go after Trump. There's a lot of random nutballs, and a lot of them don't like Trump. So when it comes to this election, obviously, if it ends up being super close, you'll see the left go all out to contest everything they can. And there will be structural advantages they will have. So let's say this election comes down to 1,000 votes in Michigan. Well, Michigan's governor is a Democrat. Michigan's Secretary of State is a Democrat. Michigan's Attorney General is a Democrat. And the fact that's the case, and they're also, pretty capable and aggressive Democrats who have a track record of trying to use the law for political ends. So, for example, they prosecuted Trump electors in Michigan because they thought that was a useful thing to do. The Trump electors in 2020 who had tried to sign his thing that he'd won. So what that does mean, and that also by extension means they have a left-leaning Supreme Court at this point. So what that means is, they have an apparatus that will, on any contested issue, likely be able to rule in their favor. Now, is that the same as actual fraud? I don't think so. You'll see Democrats who would think that 2000 in Florida was like that, because in 2000 in Florida, the Republicans benefited from having a state government that's mostly on their side. That's just one of the things about politics is if you have an advantage in a local political jurisdiction, you can sort of make it so you win every tiebreaker. That will feel like BS to some people. It often does involve BS. It's not the same as organized systematic fraud. So what I'd say is I think in certain areas, Democrats will have the ability to maybe they can, on the margins, make it so a few votes go their way or a few votes that would be against them don't get lodged for Trump. I don't think they have the ability to, if the results are coming in and Trump is up by a full % in Michigan, I don't think they can gin up 80,000 votes to flip it. I don't think there is much evidence that is within their toolkit. And I think you would see them be a lot less freaked out than they visibly are, both online and in their private circles. So I think Trump could win a close election. There's also speculation Democrats will consider something like they'll convene their legislature and try to retract certifications, do some of the stuff that Trump had suggested doing in 2020. I don't want to rule it out, but I don't think it's super likely. I think there's a lot of obstacles to that. Similarly, you'll hear people say Democrats in the House might just refuse to certify a Trump win and try to do something there. I don't think that's likely. Again, you have several Democrats who've gone on the record who have said, if Trump wins, I am going to vote to certify it. There are some might not commit to it, but enough have that it would come to pass. This is sort of, maybe this is saccharine sounding, but there are a lot of lawmakers who genuinely believe in the American system and would consider it going too far to blow it up. And that's something we saw in 2020 as well, that a big reason Trump's efforts to overturn the election didn't go as far as they potentially could have is you had the governor of Arizona, you had the governor of Georgia saying, no, this is ridiculous, we're not going to enable it. And some of those people have been replaced by more Trump-aligned Republicans, but not all of them, including especially in Georgia, where you still have the same governor, you still have the same Secretary of State.
So how much on the voter ID concerns should actually be a concern / is the critique that it's really, just there as a method to enable more sort of chaos, variance, or potential sort of meddling? Are you sympathetic to that critique?
Yeah, well, voter ID concerns are definitely real in the sense that there are, could you cast a fraudulent vote in this election and get away with it? Yeah, I think you very easily could. We saw there's this Chinese student in Michigan cast an illegal ballot, or he went in and he filled out the form and he said he was a citizen and cast a ballot, and he seems to have maybe done this by accident. He's now getting charged. I have no idea if that will result in punishment. They might just plea it down. They might drop it eventually because it seems like it might have been an accident or something. But zoom out in big picture, and there's a lot of potential to have a lot of votes that are not legitimate. You're not allowed to check if someone is a citizen before they register. They can just sign a form promising that they are, and that's good enough for federal purposes. And there's not an easy way to check that because there's not a federal database of who is a citizen. It's actually surprising how not clear cut that can be. And what that means is there's a ton of potential for people who just aren't legally allowed to vote. There's also stuff you can do on the edges, like, you could vote in multiple states, and you might be able to catch that if you had to check for a specific person. Did this person vote in multiple states? You could probably catch them, but you'd have to know to check. And if you're not actively looking for that, it could easily happen that someone just votes in multiple states and nothing stops them. And there could even be additional things that make it harder to catch. Let's say a woman got married and changed her name, but she still has her old name as a registration that's available and she moved to a new state, let's say. So you could have, maybe she could vote under her old name in her old state and then vote under her new married name in her new state. There's a lot of things you could do to cast an illegal ballot. Now, what you can add to that is I don't know that it's super easy to systematically organize that. And I don't know that it's very easy to apply it at scale. But if you were to just decide, for example, if you're the Democrats and you think, okay, well, on the margins, a person who votes illegally as a non-citizen is more likely to vote for us than not. If you just make it so it's easier for that to happen, it will passively occur, and it might get you a few hundred, a few thousand votes you would not otherwise have gotten. And then you're benefiting from that without having to centrally organize it. And I think that is where a lot of conservatives make a mistake, is they find it more appealing to imagine a very organized conspiracy. They like to imagine Trump is up by 100,000 votes on election night. The Democrats freak out. They fire up the printing press in the basement of the DNC and they print out 100,000 votes. They drop it in some suspicious way and whoa, Biden wins. Or they like to imagine this wild espionage conspiracy from Sidney Powell where Venezuela has a secret computer program that they've infiltrated the federal government with and they're changing the votes through the voting machines. Or the CIA has their computer called Hammer and their program called Scorecard, and that's changing the votes. That's kind of more appealing to people because I think it's simple and straightforward and it makes their opponents maximally evil. I don't think there's any evidence that that stuff takes place. And I think the people who have pushed it have often found themselves quite embarrassed as a result. But I don't want to say that. I think that the focus on that obscures what is the reality, which is we don't have a lot of, really robust election security measures at the intake level. Because even the stuff I mentioned, if someone votes twice or if someone votes who's not a citizen, all you can do is punish them after the fact. We have a secret ballot, so if they get their piece of paper into the box, you can't have them unvote with our current setup. And so, like that guy I mentioned, the Chinese student in Michigan, he cast a ballot, he got caught, he's getting prosecuted, his vote is still going to count. His vote made it into the box. Like, that is getting counted. And so if you have a system where a bunch of illegals can vote, or non-citizens and illegal immigrants, if they're able to cast ballots, there's not a lot you can do to stop it from potentially flipping an election result other than like ordering a new election where if we don't change the rules, it could still happen again. And I think the fact that we just have this system persist where you can vote without proving your ID, you can vote without proving you're a citizen, it creates vulnerabilities, and it's very understandable that people view it with suspicion. I'd also add, one particularly dark thing is with this system, it incentivizes letting it happen more, because if 10 people illegally vote, you can find and prosecute them and warn people off. But Biden let in 6, 7, 8 million illegal immigrants this cycle. Let's say just by making it so no one's doing any protections, and maybe you have a few more underhanded operatives who are kind of subtly encouraging, people who aren't citizens to register and vote, and they're not really emphasizing to them that they're not allowing to do this. If you get 100,000 non-citizens to vote or 500,000 for them to vote, what are you going to do? You can't criminally prosecute all those people in court. It's too many people. And can you deport all of them? Well, people will freak out about that too. So we do have a system where the more people who break the rules, the harder it is to meaningfully stop them.
Yeah. Do you suspect that to change going forward or not really, like in future elections?
Well, for now, it's hard to say. It seems like Democrats have kind of put themselves into a ideological situation where any form of voter ID, any form of like robust check on whether a person can vote is not something they'll really tolerate. And their judges have gotten the message. So they'll say any attempt to do this is like a return of Jim Crow. Obviously, elections are conducted at the state level, so you can get a lot more robust stuff in place in red states. But like I said, one of the things is that you can register for federal elections through like a federal form, and you're just not allowed to confirm that someone is a citizen with those. So there's always ways. Right, for now, you would need to change to federal law, and for now, it's like impossible to change federal law on anything because we have pretty extreme, gridlock on any politically contentious topic in the U.S. Now, if it turns out that immigrant voters are not leaning Democrat as much as they used to, which some polls do suggest that Hispanics will be much more pro-Trump, maybe like Asian immigrants will be more pro-Trump, it could be that Democrats will get more on board with this because someone will say, hey, the perception that we need lots of like voter fraud to win is hurting us. Maybe then it starts to take off. But I would remain skeptical that anything major is going to change. It does seem that you'd need consensus to change it. And right now, at least half the political spectrum has sort of calculated that not having a lot of robust protections is not worth it for them. And that's not even to say that most of them know that this is causing fraud. I think for a lot of Democrats, they're paranoid about Republicans, and they think Republicans are always plotting to make it so blacks can't vote, make it so non-whites can't vote, just make it so anyone who's like a fringe voter has a harder time because they see them as more likely to vote Democrat. I'm sure that's how a lot of them see it. And I'm sure there's also a few who are sinister and do see that there are other advantages. But I don't think they see an advantage to changing the system. And until that changes, you're not likely to see any big nationwide shift.
What do you think? Do you think we're going to find out, this week who wins, or do you think it's going to take a while?
I think so. I get asked that a lot. I usually say I'm like 65, 70% that will know night of who wins. Because so many of the states are close. Nate Silver said this is the closest election he's ever seen, and it feels that way to me too. You have 7 major swing states that are basically all polling dead even with each other. And that does mean a lot of them are close, but what it also means is if the polls are systematically off in any direction, that it'll be kind of a bloodbath for one candidate. So if there's even a 1-point polling error in Trump's favor versus what the state level polls are saying, he's going to win all 7 of them. He'll be up significantly in all 7 of them, and it'll just be kind of clearly over. And that's sort of what we saw in 2016, if you remember. In 2016, Trump didn't win the key states by that much, but they were able to call all those states that night because, yeah, he maybe only won them by 0.75%, but 0.75% is still many tens of thousands of votes. And so a recount was not really going to change the result. And I think that's actually a fairly likely outcome. Another thing that's going to matter here is because you don't have as much early vote and because Republicans are more okay with early vote this time, you won't see the absolutely insane splits between the types of voting. And that's what made 2020 so wild, was that Trump had these huge leads that seemed insurmountable, but then the left surmounted them because the mail-in late arriving vote was so enormously in their favor. Now it's going to be more even. You're going to see both the election day and early vote are going to be more balanced. And so if one of the candidates has a big lead, it's going to be a lot less likely that big lead can be overcome. So I think it's fairly likely we'll know on election night. And I think it's almost certain we'll know by like Friday. And I think the only way you could definitely get the case where it's over, but maybe Trump is not conceding, or maybe if the other people are right and the Democrats aren't planning to concede, maybe they won't be conceding. But I think by the standards we saw applied in, say, 2016, I think we'll know the outcome sooner rather than later.
Is it true that Peanut the Squirrel secures the election for Trump and is the October surprise?
Yes, it is. Actually, all of this was just elaborate song and dance on my part. If you check the polls, like it wasn't highlighted, but in a lot of swing state polls, I think the New York Times, Siena polls have this. They would be like, what are your top issues? And it was not really remarked upon, but like the number 2 or number 3 issue in both parties was that people were worried about anti-squirrel violence. And it just seems like this is a big no. Okay, joking aside, it's a fun viral story. I don't imagine it will have any impact on the race. There are a lot of stories that will go very viral on like the online right, and they're entertaining, they're funny, they give energy, but I don't think they will meaningfully sway the outcome, because especially because it's not like Kamala did this. It's the government of the state of New York, which is not a swing state and is not Kamala. So it's a funny story. And you can see this with some other things as well. There was an issue late in just the past few weeks that some people thought would like totally tip the outcome, but it's the sort of thing that there's a lot of issues that really only resonate with people who are 100% going to vote on your side anyway. And so their impact will be limited. If you want a story that I do think might have impacted it, I wouldn't be surprised if the North Carolina hurricane potentially arrested a potential Trump loss in that state. We'll see. All predictions wrong, your money back. But I think even setting aside allegations that FEMA was slow rolling aid because they didn't like the deplorables or whatever, I think that there was definitely, probably in red parts of the Appalachian area that got hit. I think it went very viral that, for example, the David Axelrod clip where he was saying like, oh, I think the people in Nashville will vote, but the people who aren't in Nashville, like they'll have more going on and they might not get to the polls. That went insanely viral. And I have to imagine it was even more viral with people who still lived in that area who, yeah, they have a lot of problems, but they still have cell phones. And I bet they got cell phone reception back pretty soon. They'll all see that. And I wouldn't be surprised if turnout is very high there. And perhaps that really motivates people to make sure that they get their vote in that race. So that would probably be like the viral story that could tilt the election in the last month that could really come into play. Now I remember the Biden calling people garbage thing. I don't think that's likely to like tip a swing vote. Maybe it's the necessary nudge that will on the margins take some MAGA supporter and cause them to actually cast a ballot. Because I can say, having been around in this for a while, you would be amazed at the number of extremely pro-Trump people who don't vote for Donald Trump. You would be astonished. I was talking to someone who was doing door-to-door outreach, and they were knocking on doors of registered Republicans who had not cast ballots in recent elections. And they went to an address, and that person, the address, they went up and they knocked on the door, the person opened, and they said, sorry, we might have an out-of-date address here. Because this person had a giant Trump flag waving from like a 30-foot flagpole, big Trump flag waving, but the data said that this person had not voted in any of the past 4 elections. And it turns out that was correct. The person had not voted. They were a huge Trump supporter, had gone to rallies, had never voted for Trump. And I've talked to people who've done voter registration at Trump rallies. An astonishing number of people who attend Trump rallies are not registered to vote. And so maybe the garbage thing is the thing that tips the marginal voter over in a few dozen, a few hundred, a few thousand cases. So maybe it'll matter, but I doubt it's a huge deal.
Yeah. It's interesting. Why don't you talk about the likely stories on both sides if their candidate loses? Like what happens there? What do they bring on and how do they bounce back?
Let me think on that for a second. I'll start with Harris. So I think that is the one I'll admit to this like sick. Obviously, okay, I'm on the political right. I want Harris to lose regardless. But one of the bonus things is I do really have the desire to read the finger pointing and recriminations and like all the dirt that is going to come up if she loses. Because much more so than with Trump, the decision to run Harris was like a calculated op by senior people in the Democratic Party who had people opposing them. In fact, it was one of the most unusual things I've ever seen. Usually when you see like the media and the left kind of come to a conclusion on something, you just see it where the momentum is always entirely in one direction and it just builds and builds and builds and builds momentum. And once you see that momentum start, it's very obvious how it's going to end. And what was so funny with them forcing Biden out was it was the only case I've really ever seen where there was really aggressive back and forth repeatedly on like an an internal dispute within the left, that you had the big surge of people in the press saying Biden has to drop out. And then Biden comes out and says, I'm not dropping out, deal with it, I'm the candidate. And so they go back a bit. And then, he does the interview. He still looks shaky. They come back. And now a few more Democrats come out and say, he's got to step aside. But then Biden comes out again and says, nope, I'm not stepping aside. Deal with it. It recedes a bit. And then, here's George Clooney. He's got an op-ed. And you have a few more Democrats and you have them bringing the pressure. They have the donors saying they're not donating. And it went back and forth like this. If you check the prediction markets, it went up and down, like from, 20% Biden becomes president or Biden's the nominee to 80% Biden's the nominee. And it whiplashed like this back and forth. And so what you had that going on there is one of the key arguments was we can't switch because if we switch, it'll almost certainly have to be to Kamala, and Kamala is terrible. And once Kamala became the nominee, you saw this intentionally inflicted mass amnesia about all these things they had said. We had the brat vibes, we had all this pro-Kamala coverage, and there's been cracks in this, but they've kind of tried to sustain this hopium ever since. And if she loses, you will see everyone abruptly remember, wait a minute, back in June, we knew Kamala was terrible, that she was the vice president that Biden couldn't find a role for. She was not really liked, but she was the least popular vice president in a long time. She had all these issues. There was no particular reason to think she would be a strong candidate. And that will, of course, be the narrative. I think they'll foist almost all of the blame on Kamala, and then there will be a lot of finger pointing about who is to blame for making us have to do Kamala. They might maybe put some blame on Pelosi, for example, who's kind of an easy person to hate on because she's very old, so she'll be out of the picture. A brave person might point a finger at Obama to the extent he was maybe involved in this, but Obama is a much more formidable political figure, so I suspect he'll probably come away less damaged by it. But yeah, they'll put a lot of blame on Kamala, as they'll just say, well, we ran this terrible candidate. We should have done the rapid primary to pick a stronger person. Or some people will say we should have stuck with Joe. He was super old, but he was weirdly popular, and he could have just resigned after the election as an alternative. You might also see some people go bigger picture and say, why was Kamala still on the ticket? They could have maybe promised her some, put her on the Supreme Court or some BS. And you put in a new vice president, such as Shapiro, anyone else, and then Biden could have stepped aside for a much more organically popular candidate. That you'll see. I think, yeah, so big picture, everyone will just put the blame. Kamala was a terrible nominee. She couldn't do any interviews. She couldn't really say her own policies. She had to rely on everyone else. That will be, and then they'll just kind of dump her. She'll vanish from the public consciousness a lot. I don't think there's a lot of constituency for keeping Kamala as a major figure if she happens to lose this race. She'll be like Dukakis or something. You never really saw Dukakis after that.
And then
for Trump.
Yeah, go for it.
So for Trump, if Trump loses, well, obviously it matters how he loses, I think. So if it's a close one where he loses again, I really don't even want to think about it because it will be very unpleasant, because I think obviously he'll claim it's fraud again. I think a very large share of people will believe him. If he claims that, we'll go along with it. And at that point, what happens to the right, it could be very unpredictable. And it would be so chaotic, I don't really think I could give much beyond that. Let's say Trump loses bad. Let's say the polling was off, a couple points in Trump's favor. And as a result, Kamala wins all of the swing states by 1% to 2%, and it looks bad. In that case, I think you'll definitely see more people aggressively criticize, try to make scapegoats. Will they be brave enough to go after Trump himself? Some might try. It's very dangerous to do this. No one really kind of attacks Trump and comes away unscathed. You'll see definitely people try to put the blame on others, and Trump himself would eventually do this. He would try to, I think that you'd see a lot of blame. You see this already. A lot of people are pre-blaming his get out the vote effort because Trump has a relatively weaker get out the vote operation that in terms of being created by the campaign itself or by the RNC itself. Instead, you have Elon Musk donated a lot of money towards get out the vote stuff. Turning Point USA, or Turning Point Action, their political arm, they've done some stuff. So you see people, they might blame them as a result. Now, would that be entirely fair? I don't think so, because I've seen some of the operations. You can't paint with a broad brush. There are people who are more competent than others. But if Trump has just a big systematic failure to win, I think the blame will say, we had all this momentum and it got screwed up because we had like no proper get out the vote operation, because like they blew up the RNC and put a Trump in charge of it, stuff like that. You'll also see, of course, political finger pointing, just like there was in 2012, Romney lost, and you had people trying to say it was because he alienated Hispanics by being critical of immigration. We have to moderate on this or that. I think in this one, you would probably, if he were to lose bad, I think the biggest political losers would be abortion opponents, because Democrats have clearly tried to turn this election into a nationwide abortion referendum. And if Trump loses, and especially if Trump loses and it's like, oh, women all voted against him, that will be the narrative. There will be, Trump had this ultra winnable election where he was ahead on every single issue, and then he was down on one issue. It was abortion, and he lost. What would come of that is not easy for me to say, because a lot of people on the right are just genuinely opposed to abortion, and it's a lot of very active and aggressive people. And or I don't know, aggressive is not the right word. It's people, a lot of like grassroots people care a lot about that issue. And if you just throw them out in like after blaming them for losing an election, I think it could cause a lot of drama within the party. But that is definitely a narrative I would see. People would attempt to do this. They would put the blame on them. Obviously, you'd also have the take of just, why did we run Trump again? He lost in 2020. Why have we had him be the candidate 3 elections in a row? We should have run DeSantis. We should have run Haley. We should have run this or that person. There will definitely be people making that claim. I don't think it would cut much with the GOP base. Trump has just such a sort of spiritual, he has a very strong bond with the Republican base as it currently exists. And I don't think a large share of them would ever be inclined to like blame Trump for why he lost. They would want to find some other person to blame for the shortcomings. That's just in the nature of things. Now, the way that could change is if Trump does something very self-destructive after the election, maybe they change their attitude as a result. That's how I would see it going. I think you would see probably the most blame would go on bad get out the vote operation, which would be they'd find someone to blame who's not Trump, or they would probably blame the anti-abortion movement, and they would say like, well, we got to moderate on this. And full disclosure, I am a pro-life person. I would find that very unfortunate, but I would understand why it would take place.
And that's a great overview. And in terms of if both sides lost, who would you suspect is like the favored candidate? Or the person in the lead? Obviously, it would be years before you even have to think about it. But would Trump be most likely the candidate in 2028, even if he lost? And
I think he would. He'd probably say he plans to run again. I don't know. I think at this point, I would have to say I don't think it would happen, because Trump he's old. He'll be well. Is he already 80? Trump age. I can't remember these things. No, he's not 80 yet. He's 78 years old. Yeah. So he's 78. He would be 82, running to go until he's 86. And let's be honest, Trump is clearly older than he was a decade ago. Trump is also like clearly older than he was 4 years ago. He is a guy who is aging. He is a guy who is slowing down. And it would be worse in 4 years. Now, he is a very confident guy. I wouldn't rule out that he would attempt to run. Would he get the nomination? Well, one, if he loses, they'll still be back with the whole like throw him in prison thing. That, I feel if they go through with that might actually that's actually how it could happen. I'm spitballing off the cuff here, but actually now that I think about it, if he loses and they throw Trump in jail and then Trump says, I'm still running anyway, that would probably be a great way for him to get on the ballot, because it allows Trump to exist entirely as a symbol of like the anger of his supporters. Just in that, I could easily see that happening. That said, he's really old, and I feel like if he loses, there's also just if he loses and goes to jail, I think there's excellent possibility he just dies. He's an old guy. He's an old guy, and He's a little bit heavier. He has shown remarkable energy and verve, or whatever word you want to use, but he's an old guy.
Yeah.
If we set Trump aside, favorite in 2028 if he loses. Truthfully, I don't know. It would very much depend on how the debate hashes out afterwards. I think it's very clear that, Vivek would want to run again. How popular would he be in this world where Trump lost? I don't know. You also already see, I think even Vivek with his latest book and with some of his speeches, you see people setting up what could be possible divisions within the MAGA movement. And it might be sort of people who are a little bit more, it's not pro-globalism, but you'll see people who are less and more populist on economics, I think is a split that you could see. You could see Vance run, although I think if they lose, one of the takes will be that Vance was a bad VP pick, and that could hurt him, but he might still be around. I don't know. Anytime a ticket loses, you always see their vice president is a guy who will be a future standard bearer, and it, for the most part, has not come to pass. Paul Ryan ended up being very unpopular in the GOP. Tim Kaine, no one cares. John Edwards did run again, even made a credible showing, but he was totally eclipsed by Obama. Yeah, I don't see an obvious favorite in 4 years. And you might even see, let's say Trump dies, you might see Don Jr. try to run as a successor of his. I don't think anyone else in the Trump family has nearly the same overall magnetism as Donald Trump, who is clearly a world historical figure in this regard. But Trump name is big, and maybe without dad around, it would be enough for him to be to make a credible play for it. But I think the field would be wide open.
Yeah.
On the Democrat side, like I said, if Kamala loses, she's just totally out. They would be this is a disaster. She will heap all the blame upon herself. Beneath her, you still have the problem that the Democrats don't have a huge roster of up-and-coming national figures. Shapiro, of course, the fact that the consensus will be Kamala was terrible, and also she should have picked Shapiro if they lose Pennsylvania. If he remains a popular up-and-coming figure, I would very much expect him to make a play. He's clearly a guy who wants to do that, and he has built up this Obama kind of copycat political style to do it. I think you'd see him run. Honestly, one of the biggest obstacles to him will be does the whole Israel-Gaza thing continue on the left? Does that become a major problem in the Democratic Party in the future? Excuse me. Will it become a major problem in the future? Impossible to say, because this war will probably be over by then, but will there be another one? Will it have grown for some other reason? Other than him, I don't know. If one thing is we've seen repeatedly is political stars can rise and fall very, very quickly. And it would be 4 years from now, there might be some other Democratic politician who, becomes a rising star because they oppose something the second Trump term does. There could be some shock office winner who wins a House seat, wins a Senate seat, wins a governor's race, and they instantly vault to presidential consideration. Yeah, I guess I would say the only one who comes to mind as an immediate, obvious potential favorite is Shapiro. But I think I would have weak attachment to that. I think he could be shoved aside very easily.
That makes sense. We're nearing at about an hour here. Is there anything we haven't discussed as it relates to election or relates to the topics that we've been discussing that you want to make sure to discuss before we wrap up, or should we close here?
Thinking on it more, I guess another thing I should have mentioned as potential candidates on either side is I was thinking in a conventional framework of, well, who are other politicians or people who have been in politics who could run? But one thing that we've especially seen is Donald Trump himself, of course, set the model that you can just be a celebrity and run for president. But also, I think the Vivek example is going to be interesting in that Vivek Ramaswamy is a younger guy, under 40, who just ran for president as a total non-famous person, and he ran, did the podcasting circuit, did the really put himself out there circuit, and he basically managed to make himself a household name who was on the short list, considered a vice presidential contender, and if Trump wins, he'll probably get some sort of job in his cabinet or immediately be able to run for Senate in Ohio. Maybe he'll replace Vance. And I think now you have this template of, if you are like, I think you might see more like business people who are open to trying to make the same play for themselves. There's often the joke that like Mark Cuban, for example, sees himself also running for president. I don't think he would succeed if he did, but the fact that he would want to try shows the appeal of it. So another thing I should just say is, I can't really name any specific person, but it could just be in 4 years, maybe you'll see a guy out of Silicon Valley just try to run as a technocrat, either on the left or on the right. And you've seen the field opens up where it sort of is like, if you're a particularly charismatic and capable speaker and individual who can frame the issues well, why would you need to do the slow climb up through being governor or being senator? Just go for the whole thing right off the top. And maybe you'll see more people attempt that, and we'll see more political talents emerge that way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good note to wrap on. Steve, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and discussing the election with us.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at eric@turpentine.co. That's ERIK @turpentine.co, and let's partner together.